conversation, discussion, and feedback on this topic. It doesn't need to be a lecture like some of our classes often are. All right, so we're talking about temptations, the topic, and just open up to James chapter 1. We're going to start there. We're going to look at not long passages. Most of the passages we're going to look at this morning, you're probably very, very, very familiar with, but we're going to look through those and pull a few things out of that. So let's look at the couple verses in James 1, verse 2, we'll start, and then we'll jump down a little farther down at verse 12. So, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Jump down to verse 12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. All right, so we use the word temptation, very loosely in our culture. We might say that, I'm tempted to eat that cookie. I'm tempted to accept your offer, like in a positive way. And then, of course, in this relationship to sin, what do we see here? What is this saying about temptation? What warning do we see in these couple verses? Yeah, so the source of the temptation is from internal, or it's coming from our own desires, and it contrasts that specifically with God. It's not coming from God. What else about temptations?
It's a gradual process. You have to resist it.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we've got a process here. It's not just boom, something is there, but there's something there's a desire that's drawing us, and then lured and enticed, and then there's this growth process that gives birth to sin, and then sin produces death. So that progression, an important distinction there. What's the warning that's given at the end? Yeah, I think in temptation and sin, we're going to talk a little bit about this, but it's a little hard to separate some of that in my mind when we're talking about that, of that. But sin is very deceitful. Temptation leading to sin is very deceitful. And I think probably one of the biggest potential blind spots for us is just not seeing it ourselves, not being honest with ourselves. So do not be deceived. And in context there, it's talking, I think, a little bit about, hey, this is coming from your desires. This is not coming from God. God is the giver of all that is good. But temptation comes from your own desires. All right, so we have temptation. They're from our own desires. They're not from God. And when temptation goes through its process, then it can bring forth death if it is not resisted. Who is tempted? Not specifically just in this passage, more of a general thing. Who is susceptible to temptation? Everybody, all types of people, all kinds of people, and even Jesus. And so that's your spectrum, right? Of the weak are tempted. But it's, you think of Proverbs chapter 7 with the foolish, or I don't know exactly the word there, but the young man who is wandering around in the streets heading towards sexual sin. It's easy to think about that person, okay, that person's wandering and he's setting himself up for failure, and he is experiencing temptation. But it is from the weakest person to the strongest person, all is going to face temptation Some of it may be in a little bit different ways, different flavors, but everybody is going to be facing this. And so, yeah, Jesus, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, being tempted in all ways like ourselves. Yeah. Right. Weak, strong, young, old, everybody is experiencing this, which there's an irony to that we'll talk a little bit about too. All right, so what about sin and temptation? What is the relationship between temptation and sin? Yeah, and it may be easy enough to like get that, right? Like temptation isn't sin. Temptation leads to sin if followed through it. I think something I've struggled with temptation is trying to discern that line between when am I being tempted and when have I fallen into sin. And I don't want to say that as in like, well, we want to walk that line and like, well, I'm just being tempted, so this is acceptable. But I think there's a guilt aspect there, a personal guilt aspect that's a little hard, at least in my mind, to manage. Of like, am I being tempted right now? Do I need to repent of what I have just experienced? Or is this temptation that I'm resisting and I don't need to feel guilt that this thought came into my head or that this thing happened and that I'm actively resisting it, and I can move on without this deep feeling that I have transgressed or sinned? I don't know if you can relate to that, but I feel like for me, it's a little bit hard to do that. And I think it's valuable to remember that just because I am tempted does not mean that I have sinned. Just because I have struggled with something doesn't mean that I have entered into sin, but yet needing to resist. Say what? It's like route to destination. Temptation is the route. Sin is the destination. Right. Ways of getting off of that path and ways of jumping out before it gives birth to sin. And I think this is something valuable to be aware of, at least with our children. I think, again, households are differently and personalities are different. I'm a very detailed, by the rule book kind of person as a kid. And so the way that I understood things was different than my siblings, and it hit me harder in different ways. And so your children, knowing your children matters. But I think helping our children understand the distinction between them being drawn to something or that they want something and that they are being tempted to pursue that and then doing that, and understanding the distinction there so that they don't feel overwhelmed by all their desires and feel that their desires are wrong, and the distinction there. So I think it's important to make that distinction and to share that distinction both with ourselves and and with our children.
There's also a challenge in that too of understanding when you put yourself in a position
Sure.
to be tempted.
Right.
And understanding sometimes I'm positioning myself well to sin because I put myself in a place to be tempted when I didn't have to.
Right.
That's something you sort of have to learn as you go through this process. That if I'm going to avoid it, the best thing to do is avoid it and not put myself in that position.
Right. The idea that, yes, I'm being tempted, but it's my own fault that I'm being tempted, or I'm being tempted because of other sin. Other sin can lead to other temptation that you've put yourself in a spot where it's a messy spot. But what does that require? Self-control, discipline, wisdom. I think it goes back to that honesty. And I think it's hard to be honest with oneself, but there's the do not be deceived. That acknowledgement of, oh, I am the guy wandering down that street in Proverbs 7, and that's why I'm being tempted. It's because I put myself up for that. And recognizing that, and being able to assess that yourself.
And we all tend to think that we're capable of being in this position and yet not being tempted or whatever. So we kind of try to start going down that fan line and deal with it
Right.
There.
Right.
Actually playing with fire. Sometimes we're tempted to play with fire. We feel like fire's not going to burn us.
Right. Yep. There's definitely that danger.
I think the challenge with being honest with yourself is Satan attacks our minds. We can easily convince ourselves that we're being honest with ourselves that we're not. So we can't neglect God's role when it comes to temptation. We're not coming to Him when we're being tempted and asking for help. We're not taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and I think that theme right there, us by ourselves in our own brains, is a dangerous situation to handle temptation. Us by ourselves, and we'll come back to that in a couple different phases of that. All right, so is it bad if I'm tempted? Like, not necessarily. To Tom's point, it could be being bad that you're tempted because you put yourself in a spot where you're having to face that temptation. But there's also just temptation that's going to come, and it's not bad that you have a desire. It's not bad that you have a temptation, but what you do with that. And the importance of being able to recognize something as temptation and not allowing that to surprise you, sneak up on you, or deny it. I think like resisting temptation doesn't mean denying that you were tempted. As in like, oh, was I experiencing temptation? Was I being tempted there? No, I'm not tempted by that. That's not temptation. That's not resisting temptation. That's more pretending that you're not facing temptation. Resisting is recognizing I am tempted by that, and then resisting it and fleeing that. It may be tempting to do the first one of like, well, okay, no, that's not me. But there's value in acknowledging it, recognizing it, calling it what it is, and then reacting to that appropriately. Turn over 1 John. This has a little bit to do with our desires. So what we saw in James, it comes from our own desires. So what are we supposed to do with those desires that it comes from? Let's read 15 and 17 of chapter 2, 1 John. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So we get this contrast here. There are desires that we have that are fine and good by themselves in certain things, not just sexual desires, but desires that we have. But what do we have here? Are there desires that are also wrong in and of themselves? David. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The desire for somebody else's thing. I would maybe say covetous is a certain level of desire, as in like, hey, I like someone else's thing is one thing. The desire of having something isn't the wrong. Right. The level of that desire and what you're willing to do with it. Right here, like part of me would want to go like, no, their desire in general, the root desire is not necessarily something wrong, but there are desires that are perverted distortions of a legitimate desire, or as the passage says here, it's the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. Where are those coming from? It's saying those are the world's desires. And so what is the contrast here. We've got the world, the desires of the world. If that's what you're pursuing, if that's what you're loving, the world is passing away along with those desires. Those are going. But then whoever does the will of God abides forever. So I think one of the important things in life, in handling sin and handling temptation, is that aligning of our desires with God's. If our desires are primarily worldly focused, worldly desires, then what's going to happen with temptation and sin? You're going to be welcoming a lot more temptation and therefore a lot more opportunity for sin into your life if your desires are aligned more with the world in that. But if we align our desires with God's will, and we are whoever does the will of God, if we can align our desires to not be battling what God's desires are for us, then it sets us up for a lot better success. We'll come back to that in just a moment. What does most temptation and desire revolve around? Yeah, self. It's hard to find a sin, maybe it's even impossible, or a temptation that is not about pleasing oneself. It is about putting yourself above others, your needs above other people's needs, or numbing some kind of unpleasantness in your life so that you feel good. And I think Philippians chapter 2, the passage about the mind of Christ and having that mind of selflessness is probably the best antidote for that aspect. If we can grow into having that mindset, that dislodges some of the grip that temptation and sin has, because it is so rooted in ourselves and our own satisfaction. All right, so that the passage here that we were just looking at, so don't love the world, love the Father, do the will of the Father. We need to recognize that those worldly desires draw us away from God, drawing us towards sin, and then end up producing death. All the shiny things in the world are going to be passing away, and it sure is hard to recognize that in the moment. But that's what some of this is for. This is what some of the scripture is for, is helping remind ourselves of that long-term game, of what is going to be lasting. So yeah, if we desire the things of the world, we're going to be putting ourselves in snare after snare. If we can align our desires with God, that's going to lead towards eternal life. All right, so will we still face temptation if our desires are aligned with God? And we already answered that, right? Like Jesus's desires and will was perfectly aligned with God. Yet he still faced temptation, yet he still faced suffering and trials. So it's not just like, oh, the solution is change your attitude and change your perspective and align your desires with God and temptation's gone. Like, no, that's going to still be here. You'll be more prepared and you'll be more ready to handle it, but it's going to still be there. Types of temptation. What are some of the things that we face throughout life as humans, as men? And it's not all sexual. I feel like sometimes when there's a class on temptation or a book on temptation, it's primarily about sexual temptation, because that's typically, for most men, a huge daily part of life is sexual temptation. And we don't need to pretend that that's not true, but it's also a disservice to pretend like that's the only temptation that we face. Because if we do, and we only train against that temptation, you're going to get sucked up and eaten by something else. Like whether or not you conquer and control your sexual appetite, there is so many other things that we are going to struggle with and be tempted by beyond that. So having that balance, not just balance view, like sexual temptation is real and it's hard. But there's a lot of other stuff that we need to be careful that we don't miss. So like, what are some of the temptations that we face? Greed. I think that's a huge one. Different people, different things. But I think for me, like greed is a hard one. Food addictions, overindulgence. And that like sums up almost everything. Prideful ambitions, the desire of self.
Tend to camouflage those things because I know when I was much younger, my focus and my belief was, okay, my job is to provide for my family. And that becomes my mission, my purpose. And so that sort of allowed me to think about, everything I need to do to get there.
Right.
And that can lead you into greed and all of that stuff because I think I'm doing the right thing, but yet, it's taking me down a path that maybe I shouldn't.
It's almost like it's permission to do the wrong thing. It's like I'm justified in my pursuits. And that goes back to what? Self-deception of not being able to be honest and clear with the situation and the motives and the heart there. I'm going to throw a bunch up here. Pride, appearance before men, speech, speaking evil of others, tongue, misuse of your tongue, anger, murder. Murder is not probably something that people are struggling with, but what did Jesus say about anger and murder? Those are connected. Jealousy, envy, coveting, selfish desires, being friends with the world, desiring to be close and with the world, boasting and bragging, cheating, taking advantage of somebody, self-indulgence, fits a bunch of things, wandering from the truth. I don't know if that's typically something we throw in the category of temptation, but like doubt, wandering from the truth, wandering away from the narrow path onto the wide path, that is a temptation. Whether it's because you want to be friends with the world or for other reasons, that is a temptation we have to be aware of. Following after power, lust, divorce, retaliating, so responding in the wrong way to people and taking vengeance or retaliation, hate, money, worry. Worry is a temptation. Anxiety is a temptation. It's a temptation that, like Jenna came up the other day and expressed that is a problem for her. It's been a problem. Anxiety and stuff has been a problem and is a problem for me. Worry is a temptation for people, and it's something that God has called us beyond. That's a temptation. Temptation to judge others, to just take the easy path. Suffering can produce temptation. Going through physical suffering produces temptation. Going through different kinds of suffering gives opportunity for you to be weak and to move on. That was the whole list there. Now, all of that, and it's not the full thing, those are all taken from Matthew 5 and James. All of those sins there. Those are sins that are being warned against, that Jesus is speaking against, or James is addressing in his book. And going back to that, it's a lot more than just sexual sin and just lust. There's a whole lot of things that we are susceptible to, and that we need practice on, and we need help through. All right, so temptation, the what? It's the bait and the trap. It's something enticing us. It comes from our own desires, and the purpose is to lead us away from God and eventually bring death. So let's go back to James chapter 4, and talk a little bit about the toolkit, the steps. What's the solution with actually dealing with temptation? And so let's read verse 7. We'll start in verse 6. But he gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So what's the formula James is giving in the context here? And this isn't specifically just dealing with temptation, but if you look at the beginning of chapter 4, he's talking about what causes the quarrels and fights among you. Is it not this? Your passions are at war with you. You desire, here we have that desire again, and you don't have, so you murder. You covet and you can't obtain, so you fight and quarrel. So it's like these desires are producing strife in their life. They have these desires, they're not handling them well, and it's leading them into sin. And what's James' formula that he gives?
Submitting ourselves to God will give us the wisdom and discernment, the ability to resist things that we might not otherwise be able to.
Yeah, submitting to God, humbling ourselves before God, and then resisting the devil, and then drawing near to God. It's a little bit of a sandwich there of just the aspect of submitting and humbling ourselves to God, and then drawing near to God, and in between there, resisting and fighting. So how do you handle a dangerous situation? I'm not an expert at this, and someone else can tell me maybe the better way.
The first suggestion of attack generally is to run.
To flee, to run. So a couple months ago, we were on a walk in our neighborhood, and we have a small neighborhood. We were out there, all the kids were coming out. We're about the farthest point from our house, and somebody's dog runs out of the house. Oh, it's a little fuzzy little dog. And so we get down and you're like, okay, hey, little doggy. And then as we do that, their other dogs come bursting through the screen door and come rushing at the kids. So what do the kids do? Well, they just run to daddy. I put my arms around them. I spin around and kick the dogs in the head, and they all run back into their house. Like, right? No, that's not what happens. The kids scatter. Raya runs off screaming this way. Weston runs this way. The two dogs are chasing him and nipping at him and knock him down. He falls down. No, they scattered. They ran. So they had the flee part, but they didn't have the flee in the right direction part. They were panicked and they ran. And so think about that with God. God is a good father. He will protect us if we run to him. If we draw near to him, he is willing to protect us. He has all love, all power over us and to protect us. And so it's easy to see that with the kids. Run to the parents. They can't help you if you run in different directions. Run to them. And that's what God is telling us here, is to draw near to him. And there's nothing he can't handle. Parents, we can get ourselves into situations where we can't protect our kids. God is able to do that. Going back to what David said there about running, what is the standard procedure if you were to tell your wife or your daughter, if you're in a dangerous situation, what would you tell them to do? What are the steps? Somebody is trying to harm them. Bobby?
Scream and run.
Scream and run. And then run. You don't stay and fight. You don't encourage them. Yes, you engage in the fight, stay there. No, you scream, you run, you resist, and then you flee. And where do you flee to? Say again? You flee to safety. You flee to where others are. You run from the thing, and you draw near to others. As guys, like, we might like the idea of stopping at number 2, the resist part. Like, oh, I'm going to resist. I'm going to stand my ground. I'm going to pull out my gun, or I'm going to tackle them, and I'm going to. But like, I get the macho feel to that, and maybe some of you all could handle it. But like, your best option for safety is to resist and run, to get out of there. Remove yourself from the situation. Draw into safety. If you do number 2, just resist without number 3, drawing near, it's not going to work. You're not strong enough. And maybe, again, physical life, maybe that I'm sure that could work out in your favor. But in spiritual life, we're going up against temptation. We're going up against Satan. We're going up against things that are bigger than ourselves. And so the manly macho stand my ground and take it is dangerous in spiritual. Removing yourself, fleeing and resisting, and then drawing near. And so those are the two big things I want to talk about for the rest of the time is drawing near to God and drawing near to each other. David.
Training every 3 months. Before we're supposed to be trained basically to run, hide, and fight. Only time we're gonna have to shoot.
In that order.
Run, hide, to a barrier, us and threat, and then if they get through, you know, try to take them out. And that's the thing that is. And so spiritually, see that God, get away from it. And say, it tells call the police.
Right. Calling reinforcements. Yeah. So those steps: submitting to God, humbling yourself, and that resisting the devil. That's active. That's not passive. That's the resisting. Like again, going to that physical example, resisting is definitely a pushing and a fighting and a physical action away from something. Not just like, okay, I'm not going to let you drag me. It's a fight against. What are some examples come to your mind of biblical examples of people resisting temptation? It's kind of interesting. A lot of our examples of failure are failure, of falling into sin. But what are some examples of resisting successfully? Joseph's probably one of the biggest of like when our mind goes to, of Joseph resisting that, fleeing that, suffering the consequences thereof, but then in the end, such great reward.
As well. He was in a position of power, could continue to be in a position of power, but he resisted that temptation.
Yeah.
To the will of man.
Yep. Daniel and his friends early on and later on in his life, as a young man and as an old man, resisting that temptation and what was that temptation? Joseph's temptation was sexual power. What was Daniel's temptation?
Eating things that would have been
Violating, transgressing God's will, to be like those around him, or to maintain his power, or to not go through suffering. Jesus, of course, is the pinnacle example in the New Testament of him being tempted and going through that. Job, to an extent there too, is someone who's faced a lot of suffering, trial, and temptation, and resisted throughout that. All right, so drawing near to God. Let's go over 1 Peter. It's kind of a parallel verse to James. It's very, very similar in its content. Verses start in verse 6. Time-wise, do we go till a quarter, or do we go closer to 10, or kind of? I know it's not a hard stop. Okay. Verse 6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. So we got a lot of similar concepts here to what James is saying there. Step 1 here is humble yourself before God. Put yourself under his protection. It adds another layer here, though, about specifically like casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. So humble yourself and then bring your problems to him. All your fears, your worries, your temptations, your desires, cast them on God. He is asking for that. And this is not something that I excel at. This is not something that I have developed well.
There's a reason. We just went through the New Testament. I don't know if it is, but the idea of humbling ourselves, having humility, is filled with passages about that. There's a reason for that. It's what God understood. We're going to struggle with that. It's this constant reminder that we need to have for ourselves for lots of reasons. But this is
Yeah, across the board for humankind. But like going back again to the sexual sin of like, which is greater, pride or sexual lust? Like, those are two of the biggest things that we end up facing. So before resisting and the devil here, it's humbling God and casting your anxieties on him. So taking these things to God, and then being sober, resisting him, like it says in James. It says being firm in your faith. How do you get the firmness of faith? To be able to stand firm. So having God's word and God's strength there.
Turning to him in our weaknesses will strengthen us.
So getting strength in our weaknesses from God. And part of it is going through trials and temptations. James talks about like the one who's you endure trials, you become strong. And quick sidebar in this, I think I taught this wrong in the kids class. I was making a very big distinction between trials and temptations. Of like, trials are things that you endure and become stronger out of. Temptations are things that are trying to kill you and will bring you into sin and death. But I was looking into that a little bit more. It was not as clear a distinction as I thought it was in some of the uses of temptation. Like, the King James Version actually translates that as temptation in James chapter 1, as in temptation. You endure temptation and you become stronger. So I was trying to make a big distinction between that. I'm not sure there is. I think trials and temptations are things we can both endure, both of those things, and come out stronger on the other end. Not that we would desire necessarily to endure those, but okay. Casting anxieties upon him, being careful, sober, and then this is a big part I want us to take away from today, is what is his encouragement after resisting the devil? The same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And then after you've suffered, there's hope beyond the suffering too. But he points out that everybody else across the world, all your brothers, are also enduring things. Yeah, David.
And contextually, he started in chapter 4, verse 1, with this suffering theme, and he said, first of all, remember, Christ suffered in the flesh, as did you. The writer of Hebrews reminds us he was tempted in all points like as we are yet without sin. But he clearly in chapter 4 is talking about some temptations and suffering that have to do with the lust of the flesh. Not all of them, but certainly some of the things that he talks about in chapter 4 that Christians were dealing with and their sufferings in the flesh had to do with their former way of life and their sufferings. And he starts all of this by saying, Christ suffered in the flesh. And now the other bookend is your brothers are suffering the same thing. We're all in this together.
Thank you for the additional context there. So the encouragement of like, you're not in this alone. There's others going through this and you aren't alone. Yeah, Bobby.
I heard a preacher making the point a number of years ago about a man in the congregation that had a problem with alcohol drinking, and he struggled with it very, very much so. And there was an older man who took it upon himself to did was every day, he met the man at the bus stop where he got off the bus to go home and walked with him past the bar that was the temptation to just give him the strength to make it past there until he was strong enough on his own to do it. We're not alone. There are people that will do whatever they can to help you with whatever you're facing.
Yeah.
Just like you can help others with what they're facing.
There's a lot.
Everybody's got strength and everybody's got weakness.
And there's a lot of power in that. I want to spend some time after this piece talking about that. Okay, so we've also got, and David mentioned this, Hebrews chapter 2, flip over there, Hebrews chapter 2 and chapter 4, they're talking about how Jesus is our example in temptation and suffering. Verse 17 of chapter 2, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Christ has gone through suffering and temptation. He has suffered in that process, and because of that, he's able to those who are actively being tempted. And then at the end of chapter 4, since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, the one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. This is a great picture of what James was encouraging and what what Peter was encouraging. Draw near to God. Jesus has experienced suffering. He has experienced trial, temptation. And we, in verse 16, can draw near to the throne of grace to receive mercy in time of need. We can draw near to God. And like that is, you mentioned humility. Like humility is a huge theme and core principle of living as a Christian, and being pleasing to God. What have all three of these passages been talking about, though? The solution to this is drawing near to God. Drawing near. And I think it is easy to just be like, okay, the answer. What should you do in temptation? Draw near to God. You're experiencing trouble? Draw near to God. What's the answer? Where should we turn when we're struggling? Turn to Jesus. It sounds a little too simple, a little too like, well, okay, great. They told me to get close to God. Now that's what I'm supposed to do. Is it true? Yeah, Dave.
The stones, bread, food, lust of the flesh, casting yourself off the temple of God's life, bowing down and have all the glitter in the kingdom as the lust of the eye. Really, all three temptations were rolled up into all three of those temptations all at once. It's just those are the central leaders of those temptations, I think. But what did Jesus do as his solution? And of course, we always go back to the scripture correctly.
Right.
And the more we draw near to God, the more we'll be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, it's not that simple. Figure it out.
Right. It's not as simple as in, well, draw near to God. Okay. I'm close with God now. Now the temptation has no hold on me. That is an effort and a work and a growing process. So like in one way, it seems like, oh, that's too simple. That's not very helpful. But that's what the Bible is telling us, is to deal with this, draw near to him, draw near to Jesus, draw near to God. And so, yes, that's the solution. Now, the practical parts of going through, like, how do I draw near, is what I need a lot of work and growth in that practice and that habit of whether it's the daily reading, daily, like what does that look like to do that? But what I would suggest is that, and challenge that, if we are honestly seeking God and we are trying to draw near to him, it's going to be a whole lot easier to recognize the temptation and a whole lot easier to resist that temptation. And that's what God is giving us as the instructions. And if we are honestly seeking and trying to do that, I think that is going to give us a huge leg up in the resisting category. And this is a proactive thing, not just a reactive thing. It's not just, well, I am struggling with temptation, and therefore, now because I'm struggling with this, I should draw near to God. That can be true, but if it's done proactively, then it's giving you that protection going into this and causing less of that. If you just run smack dab into temptation and desire and that, and you haven't been building up or drawing near to God, what's more likely to happen is that you're going to give in, and then it turns into sin and brings about death. It's not a fair test of whether God is giving you a way of escape or whether drawing near to God works if you're not doing it beforehand. Thoughts on that?
He would tell young couples this, or get ready to be married, whatever, have a plan. Because it says you are going to be tempted, so have a plan. But this thing, God's given us the plan. It's whether or not we incorporate it, you would prepare for it. He's given us the plan.
I think there's a leap here, though. Go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians. There's a leap here that is a little bit tough, is like the how. And I don't have the answer today. So, of like the how of, great, this is our plan. We need to draw near to God, and what we're going to talk about here and draw near to each other. But like, what does that look like in reality? What does that practically end up being versus the idea of like, okay, I know I need this. Like, what does it look like? So look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. So the context here, he is giving a little bit of he's talking in chapter 10 about Israel and how some of their issues. And in verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. So they were desiring something wrong. Verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Passage again that we're probably very, very often quoted, very familiar. What's the warning here? Take heed lest you fall. The comfort that is being given here is that, hey, this is not something that's new. You're not facing something anybody else hasn't faced. And then the idea that the temptation's power is limited. So that first part, there's humility again, saying being humble. Don't it doesn't use the word humble there, but take heed lest you fall. Recognize where you are, lest you fall. The idea, you've got to humble yourself and not be arrogant. Arrogant people fall hard. You go into something and it's easier to see in others. Somebody who's ignoring the red flags, they're ignoring the issues, they think they've got it under control, and then it can really, 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 really hurt. But it takes humility to get through that, to recognize that in yourself and to get through that. I think this is one of the biggest things about temptation, or that I'm wanting to emphasize, is this idea that you are not alone. It's common to man that isolation is dangerous. So no temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. You're not facing something that other people haven't faced. And their very specific issue might be a little bit different. Like that particular version or flavor might be different, but it's not something new and it's not something that others don't relate to. And I think temptation and sin, and one of the most dangerous pieces is that isolation, that feeling of isolation. Because this passage is telling us we're not alone. In 1 Peter, God was saying, your brothers across the world are also enduring suffering. But what does it feel like when you are facing temptation? Man, it feels like I'm the only one how would anybody else think something like I'm thinking? How would anybody else face what I'm facing? It would be so embarrassing to tell somebody this. I think parental relationship is a great training ground. I think God has given that as a training ground in some ways for us to be able to reflect and see. Can you imagine a child, if you have a child, or imagine if you had a child or a relative that had a burden that they were bearing? Let's just say an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old. So they're carrying something that's super heavy for them. And if you can remember being a kid, there are times where you feel just a real heavy guilt or a real heavy burden. Can you imagine them not being willing to share that with you because they don't know if you'll understand? They don't know if you'll laugh at them, if you'll despise who they are. But what do we know as adults? That if your kid came with anything, how would you handle that? What would you do with it? Is there ever a point where you go, kid, that's too much sin. That's too off the deep end. I can't handle you. Get out of my sight. But that's what it feels like when we're facing temptation. Will I be received? Will I be helped? Or am I too gone? And it's hopefully helpful to reframe that with a kid, because we know that we would open our arms and help that person, help that kid, and welcome the confession, whether it's sin or whether it's just a struggle, and welcome that. But when it comes to ourselves, or when it comes to me, it is hard to recognize that and follow through on that. Anybody who wants to manipulate you and influence you to do wrong wants you to feel alone. When you are isolated and you are alone, you are powerless and they are in control. And Satan wants us to feel alone because then we are powerless. Proverbs 18:1 talks about how the isolation breaks sound judgment. When you are isolated and you are by yourself, you don't make good decisions. And so the temptation, trials, suffering, physical suffering, sin in your life all has the very real potential of isolating you and making you feel like you're alone, pinned in a corner, that it's just you, you can't escape, nobody else struggles with this. I can't even believe that this came into my mind or into my heart. You think about somebody else, like they would never struggle with this. They would never be facing something like this. And we have to recognize that one of the huge things that God has given us is drawing near to him and drawing near to his people. The other part of that verse, the encouraging but challenging part, that God doesn't allow us to be tempted beyond what we can handle, but by drawing near to God, we can get through it. There's always the way of escape. And so then Galatians chapter 6, this idea of bearing each other's burdens. Galatians 6, 1 and 2. And this is really talking about sin. This isn't just talking about someone who's facing temptation. But again, they're very related, they're different, they're separate, but there's a lot of the same solution here. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in the spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. So there's someone who needs help, being willing to help that person in gentleness, and then also being wise and not allowing yourself to go in there. But for that to happen, for that relationship to happen, there has to be a relationship. There has to be a relationship to be able to go to them and for them to be able to let you come to them. There's got to be visibility. You have to know that they're in sin. And I know some sins become obvious or become exposed. But how else are we supposed to know if someone's struggling with something, whether it's a sin or whether it's a temptation that they're facing? How are we supposed to know that? We have to have that visibility of that sharing. And it takes a lot of humility to be willing to do that. It takes humility to be willing to help someone in a spirit of gentleness. But there's a lot of relationship and closeness that's required for this to be effective and to be helpful. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to know ourselves and we need to know others. Know ourselves both from, like, if we're the one going through the temptation, and knowing when we need help and that, and knowing ourselves also if someone else is going through the temptation and what our level of support is, where it says, lest you too be tempted. But you have to, and this goes back to the self-deception, you've got to be honest enough with yourself to be able to recognize the temptation and to be willing to allow others to help you and bear your burden through this. I think the temptation for me, and I wouldn't be surprised with others, is to just put your head down and bear through it, get past it. And for some things that might be enough. You might be able to push through that, draw near to God. Just bearing through it by yourself probably won't do it. But drawing near to God and going through that. I want to call out the importance of red flags, seeing red flags in your own life and acknowledging them, not ignoring them, seeing red flags in other people's lives and being willing to talk to them about it. Having this closeness so that others can know and see you, you can know and see others, willing to be warned, willing to warn, the brotherhood that is helping each other. It's not, I think relationship stuff and this kind of thing is hard. And I think it's hard to see great examples of it. Good examples of it are usually quiet about this anyhow. It's not something you go and share how you're helping someone else with their struggles and their sins. But like, I think this is a huge untapped resource, is the strength of each other going through those things. Yes.
Just on the reviews and learning. I think that's a hard thing for us. I don't know if it's how much of it's cultural, but it's also just scriptural. Like, we're told not to point out the speck of someone else's eye while we have the beam in our eye. And so oftentimes I think we feel like, well, I can't share that because I've got my own issues I'm dealing with. So that's something I think that I struggle with if I see it. I've got my own issues that I come here. But I know that's not right, but that's just how I
Right, and the main thing there being the hypocritical judgment versus the coming in gentleness and love to grow. Kind of a couple bullet points here, but don't ignore the red flags. Know when you're weak. And Jesus was at a weak spot when he was going through his temptation. When are you weak? That we have our different weaknesses for different kinds of things. Being about your business, David, when his sin with Bathsheba and that temptation arose, seems to be at a time when maybe he should have been at something else. When we are busy and we are doing what we're supposed to be doing, it's a lot harder to be caught up in other temptations. And then where I mentioned Jesus returning with scripture, that's not something that I have developed strongly there. It feels funny to put it on a slide, but that is how Jesus returned with that, the idea of drawing near to God. And so last kind of thing, it's hard to fight a battle you aren't ready for. It's hard to fight a battle with temptation you haven't prepared for by drawing near to God and drawing near with others. And it's really hard to win a war by yourself. Getting through the whole war by yourself And I say that without others involved, it's going to be hard to come out of that successfully. Yeah, David. Yeah.
And then on the other restoring someone said that you which are spiritual, it helps us to be spiritually minded because of the be spiritually minded, but be finally minded. So we're just looking at carnality or physical things that won't be especially with spiritual.
Temptation is not going to go away. Like we've talked about, this is young, this is old, this is weak, this is strong. Everybody's facing this, and it doesn't end. I don't think there's a time in our life where temptation or trials or suffering end until we are taken home and with God. This is something that's reality. So the temptations may change throughout life, but you're not going to conquer the concept of temptation. But we can learn to endure it, to resist it, and grow stronger throughout it as we go. So recognize it, resist it, humble yourself, draw near to God and to his people. And then I had this on there, action, like, what do we do with that? What do we do with this? I don't know the answer. But I think there's opportunity for us. This group has been a really good group, and I really appreciate the regularity that we have of this and the content that we're going over. It's encouraging to come here and to get to spend this time. And I know today's a smaller group, but like we usually have almost 80-90% of the people here. And that is such a blessing. And it'd be a waste to waste those relationships in our walk. So the closeness and the opportunity that we have, there's real opportunity for us to help each other throughout this. So, me.
Context of topic, this idea of drawing near to God. I'm going to say you guys, but I'll myself. We have a really good opportunity to start teaching our kids, our young kids, what does it mean to draw near to God? And how do we do this? So that they are preparing themselves so that they're older when they start. They understand what that means. They have some concept of what that means. So you know, start to teach. I know most of the guys do, but what does it mean to draw near? How do we do that? What is involved in doing that? It's studying God, it's coming together, I mean, all the things that are incorporated in drawing near to God. They need to understand that at a early age. No, don't do that.
It's also this pursuit, and this is how, for me, I try to think about what am I spending time. Temptation comes from selfish desire. Right? So if you're spending time pursuing things that matter to me, and you just write it on a sheet of paper, like you look at, okay, the last week, how many things did I do that were pursuing self? How many things did I do that are pursuing love, righteousness, faith, things that come from God? You got to. That's something that I do on a regular basis to try to figure out, all right, how can I do more on this side of the sheet and less on this side?
That's next month's class.
Okay, good. All right, good.
It combats that self-deception of, look at it. And that's another thing I think that we have that opportunity for is like others can help us combat self-deception. It's easy to deceive yourself. Coaches or members or these other people that look at it on paper and be like, I don't know. That's like the forces.